An 18-year-old student crosses the border for a fresh start at university. One night of hazing rituals, one moment of chaos in the darkness, and then silence. For 16 years, a family searches for answers while a terrible secret lies buried beneath Alberta soil. This is the story of Brett Morrison, a young man whose dreams ended in a collapsed well, and the conspiracy that kept the truth hidden for nearly 2 decades. Before we uncover what really happened that October night in 2003, make sure to subscribe to Silent Evidence Reveal and hit that notification bell. We bring you the cold cases that refuse to stay buried. Drop a comment below telling us what you think happened to Brett. Now, let's dive into a case where university tradition turned into a nightmare, and powerful people chose silence over justice. Brett Allen Morrison was born on March 15, 1985 in Portland, Oregon, to parents Michael and Jennifer Morrison. He was the middle child in a close-knit family, with an older sister Rachel and a younger brother Tyler. From an early age, Brett showed a natural curiosity about how things work. While other kids played video games, Brett could be found in the garage with his father, taking apart old radios and trying to put them back together. His high school years at Lincoln High School in Portland were marked by academic excellence, particularly in mathematics and physics. Brett was not just a student who memorized formulas, he understood the principles behind them. His physics teacher, Mr. David Patterson, later recalled that Brett had an intuitive grasp of complex concepts that usually took students years to develop. He was not the loudest student in class, but when Brett spoke, his insights often changed the direction of the entire discussion. Beyond academics, Brett was an avid outdoorsman. The Pacific Northwest provided endless opportunities for hiking, camping, and exploring. He spent countless weekends with his father and brother hiking the Columbia River Gorge and camping in the Cascade Mountains. These experiences fostered in Brett a deep appreciation for nature and a confidence in outdoor settings that would later play a tragic role in his story. During his senior year of high school, Brett faced an important decision about his future. He had received acceptance letters from several universities, including Oregon State University and the University of Washington. However, one acceptance letter stood out. The University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, offered him a spot in their prestigious engineering program with a partial scholarship. The program was known for its rigorous curriculum and its connections to the Canadian energy sector. For Brett, this represented more than just an education, it was an adventure. The idea of living in another country, experiencing a different culture, and challenging himself in one of North America's top engineering schools appealed to his sense of curiosity and independence. His parents had mixed feelings. Jennifer Morrison worried about her son being so far from home, especially in a different country. Michael Morrison, however, recognized the opportunity and encouraged Brett to take the leap. In August 2003, the Morrison family made the long drive from Portland to Edmonton, helping Brett move into his dormitory at the University of Alberta. The campus impressed them immediately. The mix of historic buildings and modern facilities, the diverse student population, and the energy of a new academic year created an atmosphere of possibility. Brett's room was small but functional, and he quickly decorated it with posters of his favorite bands and a map of Alberta, marking places he wanted to explore. The first few weeks of university life were everything Brett had hoped for. His classes challenged him intellectually, pushing him beyond what he had learned in high school. He particularly enjoyed his engineering design course, where students worked in teams to solve real-world problems. Brett's roommate, Carlos Mendez, was a local student from Edmonton who helped Brett navigate both the academic and social aspects of university life. However, Brett soon learned that being an engineering student at the University of Alberta came with certain expectations. There was a strong culture of tradition within the engineering faculty, including initiation rituals for first-year students. These hazing activities were technically against university policy, but they persisted as an unofficial rite of passage, organized by upper-year students and sometimes tacitly approved by faculty members who had themselves gone through similar experiences. Brett heard rumors about these initiation events from the moment he arrived on campus. Some stories were relatively harmless, describing scavenger hunts around Edmonton or silly challenges that first-year students had to complete. Other stories were darker, involving excessive drinking, humiliation, and potentially dangerous activities. The Engineering Students Association officially condemned hazing, but everyone knew it still happened. In early October 2003, Brett received an invitation that he had been both expecting and dreading. Upper-year engineering students were organizing an initiation night for first-year students. The event was scheduled for Friday, October 17th, and would take place at a rural location outside Edmonton, near the town of Drumheller, Alberta. The invitation was vague about specific activities, but emphasized that attendance was strongly encouraged for anyone who wanted to be truly part of the engineering community. Brett discussed the invitation with Carlos, who had received the same message. Carlos was skeptical about attending, having heard concerning stories from his older brother about previous initiation nights. However, other first-year students they knew were planning to go, and there was subtle pressure to participate. Not attending could result in social isolation within the engineering program, being labeled as someone who was not a team player. Brett called home the weekend before the event. He talked to his mother about classes, about the cold weather that was already settling over Edmonton, about a hiking trip he was planning for the following month. He did not mention the initiation night. Perhaps he did not want to worry her. Perhaps he thought it would be no big deal. That phone call would be the last time Jennifer Morrison heard her son's voice. On Friday, October 17, 2003, Brett Morrison climbed into a car with several other first-year engineering students and headed toward Drumheller, Alberta, excited and nervous about what the night would bring. He had no way of knowing that he was driving toward an event that would end his life and spark a 16-year cover-up involving students, faculty, and local authorities. Drumheller, Alberta, is a small town about 90 minutes northeast of Edmonton, famous for its badlands landscape and its connection to dinosaur fossils. The surrounding area features dramatic valleys, hoodoos, and isolated rural properties that stretch for miles with few neighbors. It was to one of these remote properties that Brett Morrison and approximately 20 other first-year engineering students were driven on the evening of October 17, 2003. The property belonged to Dr. Leonard Fisher, a 52-year-old professor in the University of Alberta's engineering faculty. Fisher had been with the university for nearly 20 years and had built a reputation as a demanding but respected instructor. He taught advanced courses in petroleum engineering and had consulting connections with several major energy companies operating in Alberta. His rural property, located about 15 minutes outside Drumheller, was a sprawling 40-acre parcel that he used as a weekend retreat. What made Fisher's property particularly attractive for hazing activities was its isolation. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. The property had minimal lighting, and cellular service was spotty at best. It was the perfect location for activities that organizers did not want observed or interrupted. The first-year students arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening, transported in several vehicles driven by upper-year students. The atmosphere was a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Some students had been drinking before arrival, while others like Brett remained sober, wanting to keep their wits about them. The upper-year students, led by a fourth-year named Derek Thompson, immediately established control, explaining that the evening would consist of several challenges that the first-year students would need to complete to earn their place in the engineering community. The first challenges were relatively tame. Students were required to complete physical tasks like push-ups and sprints while answering engineering trivia questions. Those who failed faced minor penalties like having to wear embarrassing signs or perform silly dances. As the evening progressed and darkness fell completely, however, the activities became more intense and less supervised. Around 10:30 that night, Derek Thompson announced a new challenge. The first-year students would participate in what he called the Badlands Navigation Test. Students would be divided into small groups, given a flashlight and a simple compass, and sent to find markers placed around Fisher's property. The twist was that much of the navigation would need to be done in near total darkness, simulating the challenging conditions engineers might face on remote work sites. Brett was placed in a group with 3 other first-year students. They were given their flashlight and compass and sent toward the northern section of Fisher's property, an area characterized by rough terrain, scattered vegetation, and several old structures left over from previous uses of the land. The darkness was absolute beyond the weak beam of their flashlight. The October night was cold, and their breath formed clouds in the air as they carefully made their way across unfamiliar ground. What none of the students knew was that Fisher's property contained several hazards, including an abandoned well that had partially collapsed years earlier. The well was not properly marked or secured. In daylight, it might have been visible as a depression in the ground surrounded by old concrete and rotting wooden beams. In darkness, it was essentially invisible, a trap waiting to be sprung. At approximately 11:15 that night, Brett Morrison stepped onto ground that seemed solid, but was actually the collapsed covering of the old well. The surface gave way immediately. Brett fell approximately 35 feet into darkness, hitting the sides of the well shaft before landing at the bottom. The fall happened so quickly that he barely had time to shout. His group members heard the crash and Brett's sudden cry, followed by silence. The other students in Brett's group immediately called out to him but received no response. They frantically searched the area with their flashlight and quickly discovered the collapsed well opening. Shining their light down into the shaft, they could see Brett's motionless body at the bottom, lying in an unnatural position that suggested serious injury. One of the students, Sarah Chen, would later testify that she was certain Brett was either dead or critically injured based on how he had fallen and the angle of his body. The students ran back to the main gathering area, shouting for help. What happened next would transform an accidental tragedy into a criminal conspiracy. Instead of immediately calling 911, Derek Thompson and Dr. Leonard Fisher made a decision that would haunt them for the next 16 years. Fisher examined the situation and declared that calling authorities would destroy everyone's futures. He convinced the panicked students that they needed to handle this quietly. The moments following Brett Morrison's fall into the abandoned well became a turning point where a tragic accident transformed into a criminal conspiracy. Dr. Leonard Fisher took control of the situation with a calm authority that, in hindsight, was chilling in its calculation. Rather than calling emergency services immediately, Fisher made the decision that Brett was already dead, and that calling authorities would only destroy the futures of everyone present. Fisher's reasoning appealed to the panic and self-preservation instincts of the young students surrounding him. He pointed out that they had all participated in an unauthorized hazing event on his property. The university would likely expel everyone involved. Criminal charges for hazing resulting in death were possible. Fisher himself faced losing his position, his reputation, and potentially his freedom. In the chaos and fear of that October night, his arguments found receptive ears among students who were terrified of the consequences. Derek Thompson, the fourth-year student who had organized the event, became Fisher's primary ally in the cover-up. Thompson gathered the first-year students and delivered a speech that mixed threats with appeals to their futures. He told them that if they reported what happened, they would all face criminal charges. Their engineering careers would be over before they began. Their families would be destroyed by legal fees and public shame. However, if they stayed silent, they could continue with their lives. Brett's death would be a tragic secret they would carry, but at least they would have futures. Not everyone agreed with this plan. Sarah Chen, one of the students who had been in Brett's navigation group, argued strongly for calling 911. She pointed out that Brett might still be alive and in need of immediate medical attention. Even if he was dead, his family deserved to know what happened. Her protests were overruled by the majority, who were either convinced by Fisher's arguments or too frightened to dissent. The cover-up proceeded methodically over the next several hours. Fisher instructed several of the male students to retrieve Brett's body from the well. This was accomplished using rope and equipment that Fisher had on his property. Once Brett's body was recovered, Fisher examined it and confirmed what everyone feared. Brett had died from the fall, likely from massive head trauma and internal injuries sustained when he hit the sides of the well shaft and the bottom. Fisher then made a decision that revealed the depth of his criminal intent. Rather than secretly reporting the death and attempting to create a story about an accidental discovery, he decided to bury Brett's body on his property and pretend the entire event had never happened. His reasoning was that Brett's body connected directly to the hazing event. Without a body, there was no evidence of what had happened that night. A burial site was selected in a remote corner of Fisher's property, far from the main buildings and in an area that was heavily wooded. Several students dug a grave approximately 6 feet deep while others kept watch. Brett's body was wrapped in a tarp and placed in the grave. Before the burial was completed, Fisher had the students remove any identifying items from Brett's body, including his wallet, phone, and jewelry. These items were collected and later disposed of separately to further eliminate evidence. The grave was filled in and the site was carefully camouflaged with leaves, branches, and transplanted vegetation to make it look undisturbed. Fisher took photographs of the site from multiple angles, creating a record that he could use to monitor whether the grave had been discovered. This action suggested a level of premeditation and planning that went beyond a panicked response to an accident. Once the burial was complete, Fisher addressed the students one final time. He emphasized that their lives were now bound together by this secret. If anyone spoke, everyone would be destroyed. He also made it clear that he would be monitoring them. Any hint that someone was considering going to authorities would be dealt with severely. Though he left the nature of that threat vague. The students were then transported back to Edmonton in small groups at staggered times to avoid attracting attention. They were instructed to act normally, to attend classes, and to never speak about what had happened, even among themselves. The entire event from Brett's fall to the completion of the cover-up had taken less than 6 hours. By dawn on October 18, 2003, Brett Morrison had been erased, and a conspiracy of silence had begun. In the days that followed, Brett's absence was initially not remarkable. University students missed classes and social events for various reasons. His roommate Carlos Mendez assumed Brett had gone on a spontaneous trip or was staying with friends. It was not until Monday, October 20th, when Brett failed to attend a major exam and missed several other commitments, that people began to worry. By Tuesday, October 21st, when Brett had not returned to his dorm room and was not responding to phone calls or emails, Carlos contacted university security and then the Morrison family in Portland. The disappearance of Brett Morrison triggered an immediate and extensive investigation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, working in conjunction with the Edmonton Police Service and the University of Alberta Security. Michael and Jennifer Morrison arrived in Edmonton within 48 hours of receiving the news that their son was missing, beginning a nightmare that would consume the next 16 years of their lives. The initial investigation focused on Brett's last known activities and whereabouts. His roommate Carlos provided information about Brett's classes, friends, and habits. University records showed that Brett had attended classes on Friday morning, October 17th, and had been seen on campus that afternoon. After that, his trail went cold. His bank accounts and credit cards showed no activity after that Friday. His cell phone went straight to voicemail and never connected to the network again after approximately 8 p.m. that evening. Investigators interviewed dozens of Brett's fellow students, including many who had actually been present at the hazing event on Fisher's property. Every single one of them lied. They claimed they had not seen Brett that weekend, had no knowledge of any social events he might have attended, and could not explain his disappearance. The consistency of these lies, rehearsed and reinforced by Fisher and Thompson, created a wall that investigators could not penetrate. Detective Robert Walsh was the lead RCMP investigator assigned to Brett's case. He quickly developed suspicions about the engineering students he interviewed. Their stories were too consistent, too carefully worded. Several students showed signs of stress and anxiety during interviews that went beyond normal concern for a missing classmate. However, Without physical evidence or a witness willing to break the silence, Walsh had nothing concrete to pursue. One aspect of the investigation did briefly touch on the truth. Detective Walsh learned through background interviews that unauthorized hazing events were rumored to occur within the engineering faculty. He began investigating whether Brett might have attended such an event and encountered foul play. This line of inquiry led Walsh to interview Dr. Leonard Fisher, whose name came up as someone who had hosted engineering students at his rural property in the past. Fisher's interview with Detective Walsh was a masterclass in deception. He acknowledged that he had allowed engineering students to use his property for social gatherings in previous years, but claimed he had not hosted any events during the current semester. He expressed sympathy for the Morrison family and offered to help the investigation in any way possible. He even volunteered to allow police to search his property if they believed it would be helpful. This offer, which seemed like cooperation, was actually a calculated gamble. Fisher knew that without specific grounds for a search warrant focused on his property, a casual search would be superficial and unlikely to discover a carefully concealed grave. Detective Walsh did not take Fisher up on his offer at that time, a decision he would regret for years. The investigation eventually reached a dead end. Without a body, without witnesses, and without any clear evidence of foul play, Brett Morrison's case was classified as a missing person investigation that remained open but inactive. For Michael and Jennifer Morrison, the next 16 years were a special kind of torture. They refused to believe Brett had simply vanished voluntarily. They knew their son, knew he would never abandon his family without explanation. They believed he was dead but had no proof, no body to bury, no closure of any kind. They hired private investigators, created missing person websites and social media pages, and made multiple trips to Edmonton to distribute flyers and keep Brett's case in the public eye. The conspiracy of silence held remarkably well for over 15 years. The students who had been present that night graduated, moved away, and started their careers. Some left Alberta entirely, putting physical distance between themselves and the secret they carried. Others remained in the area, but avoided any connection to the Morrison case. Dr. Leonard Fisher continued teaching at the University of Alberta, his reputation intact, his secret buried on his property. However, the psychological weight of the secret took its toll on many of the participants. Several of the students involved developed substance abuse problems, anxiety disorders, and depression. Relationships and marriages failed under the strain of a secret that could never be shared. The knowledge that they had participated in covering up Brett Morrison's death became a poison that spread through every aspect of their lives. The break in the case came in March 2019, 16 years after Brett's death. The RCMP received an anonymous tip through their Crime Stoppers hotline. The caller, whose voice was disguised electronically, provided specific information about Brett Morrison's disappearance. The caller stated that Brett had died during a hazing event at a property near Drumheller owned by Dr. Leonard Fisher, and that his body was buried on that property. The caller provided a detailed description of the burial location, including landmarks and measurements that would allow investigators to find the grave. Detective Walsh, who had retired from the RCMP but remained haunted by the Morrison case, was contacted by the investigators who received the tip. Walsh immediately recognized details in the anonymous tip that connected to his original investigation 16 years earlier. He urged the current investigators to take the tip seriously and to obtain a search warrant for Fisher's property immediately. On April 2, 2019, RCMP investigators along with forensic anthropologists and cadaver dogs executed a search warrant at Dr. Leonard Fisher's rural property near Drumheller. Following the directions provided in the anonymous tip, they focused on a wooded area in the northwest corner of the property. Within 3 hours, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains. Excavation began immediately. The discovery of Brett Morrison's remains, even after 16 years, was relatively straightforward due to the detailed information provided by the anonymous tipster. The grave was exactly where described, at the depth indicated, and Brett's skeletal remains were largely intact. Dental records confirmed the identity within 48 hours. After 16 years of uncertainty, Michael and Jennifer Morrison finally had confirmation of what they had always feared. Their son was dead, and his death had been hidden from them for more than a decade and a half. The discovery of Brett's remains triggered a rapid criminal investigation that quickly unraveled the conspiracy. Armed with physical evidence and the knowledge that someone involved was willing to talk, investigators began re-interviewing the former students who had been present that October night in 2003. The wall of silence crumbled quickly. Sarah Chen, who had argued for calling 911 16 years earlier and had lived with guilt and nightmares ever since, was the first to provide a full statement. Her cooperation triggered a cascade of confessions as other participants realized the conspiracy was over. Dr. Leonard Fisher was arrested on April 5, 2019, at his home in Edmonton. He was charged with criminal negligence causing death, indignity to human remains, obstructing justice, and conspiracy. Derek Thompson, the former student who had helped orchestrate the cover-up, was arrested the same day on similar charges. Over the following weeks, 8 other former students were arrested and charged with various offenses related to the cover-up. The trials that followed were sensational and heartbreaking. The full details of what had happened on October 17, 2003, finally emerged. The court heard testimony about the hazing event, about Brett's fatal fall, and about the calculated decision to hide his death rather than face consequences. Dr. Fisher was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Derek Thompson received 10 years. The other students received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years, depending on their level of involvement in the cover-up. For Michael and Jennifer Morrison, the convictions brought a measure of justice but could never restore what they had lost. Their son's remains were finally returned to them, and they were able to hold a funeral and burial in Portland, giving Brett the final rest he deserved. They established a scholarship in Brett's name at Lincoln High School for students interested in engineering, ensuring that his memory would be associated with hope and opportunity rather than tragedy and betrayal. The identity of the anonymous tipster who broke the case open was never officially revealed, but many believe it was one of the students who had been present that night, and who could no longer live with the secret. Whoever it was, their decision to finally speak the truth brought an end to 16 years of silence and gave the Morrison family the closure they desperately needed. The University of Alberta conducted a comprehensive review of its hazing policies and enforcement mechanisms in the wake of the Brett Morrison case. The engineering faculty underwent significant cultural changes, with zero-tolerance policies for hazing activities and mandatory education programs for all students about the dangers of initiation rituals. Brett Morrison was 18 years old when he crossed the border seeking education and adventure. He never got the chance to complete his degree, to build a career, to fall in love, to have a family of his own. All of those possibilities were stolen from him in one moment of darkness on an October night. But through the persistence of investigators, the courage of someone who finally spoke the truth, and the unwavering determination of his family, Brett's story finally came to light. His case serves as a powerful reminder that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing, and that justice, though delayed, can still be served.